The bloodied shoe dropped at the fire station door wasn't just lost. It was a message. Tied to a wounded German shepherd's muzzle with knotted laces, stained with something darker than mud, it carried a plea no one could ignore. And when the dog turned those golden eyes on the firefighters, they understood. This wasn't a rescue mission. It was a reckoning. The fluorescent lights of Fire Station 12 buzzed softly in the pre-dawn gloom, casting long shadows across the scuffed linoleum floor. Lieutenant Daniel Reyes slumped over his third cup of burnt coffee, the bitter taste doing little to chase away the exhaustion of the overnight shift. Across from him, firefighter Mia Carter scrolled absently through her phone, the blue glow reflecting in her tired eyes. The dispatch radio crackled with occasional static, the only sound in the heavy silence. Then, scratching. At first, Daniel thought it was the wind. Pharaoh's old station had its share of creaks and groans, especially in the early hours when the temperature dropped. But the noise came again, sharper this time, followed by a low, guttural whine that raised the hairs on the back of his neck. Mia looked up, her brow furrowing. "You hear that?" Daniel set his coffee down and moved toward the bay door, his boots scuffing against the concrete. The sound was coming from outside, something more desperate than a stray raccoon or a branch tapping the siding. He unlatched the door, the cold morning air rushing in, and froze. There, haloed in the amber glow of the station's exterior lights, stood a German shepherd. The dog was gaunt, ribs pressing sharply against his matted coat. Dirt and dried blood streaked his fur, and his left paw left faint crimson smears on the pavement with every limping step. But it wasn't the dog's condition that made Daniel's breath catch. It was what he carried. Clenched between his teeth was a woman's sneaker, white with a faded pink stripe, the fabric stiff with old blood. The laces were knotted tightly around the dog's muzzle, as if someone had tied it there. The dog locked eyes with Daniel, his gaze piercing despite his exhaustion. Then, with deliberate slowness, he dropped the shoe at Daniel's feet. A single bark shattered the silence, sharp, commanding. Mia appeared at Daniel's shoulder, her breath hitching. Holy shit. The dog didn't wag his tail, didn't whine, just stared at them, panting, his dark eyes flicking between their faces and the shoe, as if willing them to understand. Daniel crouched, gloved fingers brushing the sneaker's blood-stained toe. The fabric was stiff, the stains old, but the laces were damp, as if recently soaked. His stomach twisted. This wasn't just a stray bringing trash. This was a message. Mia was already moving, her voice tight. "I'll get the truck. The dog..." Shadow. Mia would call him later, watched them prepare, his ears pricked forward. When Daniel opened the passenger door, Shadow didn't wait for an invitation. He leapt inside, his body trembling with exhaustion or adrenaline, and settled in the seat like he'd done it 100 times before. As the engine roared to life, Daniel glanced at the dog. Shadow's gaze was fixed ahead, unblinking, focused on the road leading toward the burned woods. Whatever they were about to find, the dog already knew. And he wasn't leading them to a what. He was leading them to a who. The headlights of the fire rescue truck cut through the pre-dawn darkness as Daniel steered down Old Mill Road, the tires crunching over gravel. Beside him, Shadow sat rigid in the passenger seat, his nose pressed against the window, fogging the glass with each anxious exhale. His ears twitched at every turn, as if mentally counting the miles until they reached their destination. Mia leaned forward from the back seat, her flashlight beam dancing over the map on her phone. "This road dead ends at the old logging trail. After that, it's all on foot." Daniel nodded, his grip tightening on the wheel. The trees loomed thicker now, skeletal silhouettes from a decade-old wildfire that had devoured this part of the forest. The locals called it the Dead Zone, a place where even animals hesitated to roam. Yet Shadow had come from there, and he was leading them back. The truck jolted to a stop where the pavement dissolved into overgrown brush. Before the engine fully died, Shadow was pawing at the door, his claws scraping metal. Daniel exchanged a glance with Mia. "You sure about this?" Mia didn't hesitate. She shoved her door open, the cold air biting at her cheeks. "That shoe wasn't just dropped there, Reyes. Someone tied it to him." Shadow hit the ground running, or rather limping. His injured paw left smudges of fresh blood in the dirt, but he didn't slow down. Daniel and Mia scrambled after him, their boots sinking into the damp earth as they plunged into the woods. The forest swallowed them whole. Charred trunks rose like tombstones, their branches clawing at the dim sky. The ground was uneven, littered with hidden roots and patches of brittle undergrowth that snapped underfoot. Shadow moved with eerie certainty, veering around obstacles without pause, his nose occasionally dropping to the ground as if confirming an invisible trail. Then he stopped dead. A torn scrap of fabric, dark blue, maybe from a sweater, fluttered from a low branch. Mia reached for it, her glove brushing something sticky. She recoiled. "Blood! Recent!" Shadow growled low and warning before surging forward again. The deeper they went, the heavier the silence became. No birds, no rustling leaves, just their own ragged breaths and the occasional creak of deadwood. Daniel's radio crackled once, a burst of static, then died. "Signal's gone," Mia muttered. Shadow didn't seem to care. He wove through a tangle of brambles, his body low to the ground, until they reached a small clearing. There, half buried under a mound of leaves and broken branches, was a shape that didn't belong. A human hand. Daniel's pulse roared in his ears as he dropped to his knees, brushing away the debris. A young woman lay beneath, her skin ghostly pale, her lips cracked with dehydration. A jagged wound split her temple, the blood crusted black in her matted hair. But she was alive. Barely. Her eyelids fluttered open, her pupils dilating in the beam of Mia's flashlight. "Help!" she rasped. Mia was already on the radio, her voice sharp with urgency. "This is Fire Station 12. We've got a female, mid-20s, head trauma and severe dehydration. Need EMS at the Old Mill tree line now." Shadow circled the woman twice before settling beside her, his body curled protectively against her side. His tongue flicked out once, licking her limp fingers as if to say, "You're safe now." But as the paramedics loaded her onto the stretcher, the woman's hand shot out, her fingers clutching Mia's sleeve with surprising strength. "There's another one," she whispered, deeper in. Shadow's head snapped up, his ears pricked forward, and just like that, the hunt began again. The woman's words. "There's another one," hung in the air like a blade. Shadow didn't wait. Before Daniel could stop him, the dog lunged back into the undergrowth, his paws kicking up damp earth as he vanished between the scorched pines. Mia swore under her breath. "We should wait for backup." Daniel hesitated, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The forest felt different now, heavier, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. Somewhere ahead, Shadow let out a sharp, urgent bark. "Too late," Daniel muttered, and plunged after him. The trail twisted deeper into the woods, the canopy thickening until the weak morning light barely filtered through. Shadow moved like a ghost, his dark coat melting into the shadows, only the occasional flash of his eyes confirming he was still ahead. Then, abruptly, he stopped. The shack emerged from the gloom like a nightmare. It leaned precariously to one side, its weathered boards gray with rot and blackened by the old fire. The roof had partially caved in, and the few remaining windows were nothing but jagged teeth of broken glass. But it was the door that made Daniel's skin crawl. Fresh scratches raked the wood, deep grooves that could only have been made by claws. Or desperate fingers. Shadow's lips peeled back in a silent snarl. Mia unclipped her flashlight, the beam trembling slightly in her grip. "Someone's been here," recently. The stench hit them before they crossed the threshold, a sickening cocktail of mildew, rust, and something coppery beneath it all. Daniel's stomach twisted as he pushed the door open, the hinges screaming in protest. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. A single metal chair sat bolted to the floor, its legs streaked with dark stains. Frayed ropes coiled like snakes in the corner beside an overturned bucket. But it was the object in the center of the room that made Mia gasp. A child's sneaker, small, blue, with a cartoon rocket on the side. The toe was smeared with something dark and flaking. Shadow padded forward, his nose brushing the shoe before he let out a whine so mournful it raised goosebumps on Daniel's arms. Mia crouched, her gloved hand hovering over the tiny footprint pressed into the dirt floor. A kid. Jesus, Reyes, there's a kid out here. Shadow suddenly stiffened, his ears snapped forward, his body coiling like a spring as a low, vibrating growl built in his chest. Daniel barely had time to process before the dog was moving, not toward them, but past them, crashing through the shack's back wall where the boards had rotted away. Mia's flashlight beam caught the fleeting shape of Shadow disappearing into the trees. Then, from somewhere in the darkness beyond, came a sound that turned Daniel's blood to ice, a child's whimper. Shadow's answering snarl split the night. Daniel was running before he realized it, Mia at his heels, their boots pounding the earth as they chased the sound of the dog's fury into the black heart of the woods. Somewhere ahead, a man's voice shouted, not in anger, but in fear. Shadow had found what he was looking for, and whatever, whoever, was out there was about to regret it. Daniel crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at his face as he followed the sounds of Shadow's snarling and the panicked shouts ahead. His lungs burned, but adrenaline pushed him faster. Mia was right behind him, her flashlight beam jerking wildly as they sprinted toward the commotion. The trees suddenly thinned, revealing a steep ravine choked with brambles and loose rock. At the bottom, Shadow had a man pinned against the dirt, a tall figure in a mud-streaked gray hoodie, his arms raised defensively as the dog's teeth snapped inches from his face. But Daniel's gaze locked on the small figure tied to a nearby oak. A little girl, no older than 8, her wrists bound with coarse rope, her blue sneakers kicking weakly at the ground. Her face was streaked with dirt and tears, her eyes wide with terror. When she saw them, a broken whimper escaped her cracked lips. Mia didn't hesitate. She slid down the ravine's slope, her boots skidding on loose gravel, and lunged for the girl. "Emma, honey, we're getting you out of here!" The man in the hoodie, Victor, twisted beneath Shadow's weight, his hand groping for something in the leaves. Metal glinted. "Knife!" Daniel yelled, drawing his service weapon. "Hands where I can see them!" Victor froze. Shadow's growl deepened, his muzzle pressed against the man's throat, saliva dripping onto his collarbone. One wrong move, and those teeth would clamp down. Mia sawed through Emma's bonds with her pocket knife, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "You're safe now, sweetheart. You're so brave." The second the rope snapped, Emma collapsed into Mia's arms, her tiny body shaking with silent sobs. Daniel kept his gun trained on Victor, his finger tense on the trigger. You move, and the dog finishes what he started. Shadow's amber eyes flicked to Daniel as if understanding. His jaws tightened just enough to make Victor gasp. It took 15 agonizing minutes for backup to arrive. 15 minutes of Shadow not budging an inch, his body a living barrier between Victor and the child. When the sheriff's deputies finally clambered down the ravine, their flashlights painting the scene in stark relief, Shadow finally released his grip, but not before delivering one last warning snap near Victor's face. As the deputies hauled Victor to his feet, he stared at the dog with something between hatred and disbelief. "You," he spat. "I killed you." Shadow bared his teeth in response. Emma clung to Mia as they climbed out of the ravine, her face buried in the firefighter's shoulder. But as they reached the top, she lifted her head and whispered two words that made Daniel's blood run cold. He has more. Mia met Daniel's gaze over the girl's head. More shoes, more victims. Shadow stood at the edge of the ravine, his ears pricked forward, staring into the black mouth of the woods beyond. Their work wasn't done yet. The interrogation room at Faro County Sheriff's Office smelled of stale coffee and industrial cleaner. Daniel watched through the one-way glass as Victor Greer slouched in his chair, his cuffed hands resting on the scarred metal table. The man's hoodie had been replaced with an orange jumpsuit, but the arrogance in his posture remained unchanged. He tapped one finger against the table. Tap, 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 like a metronome counting down to some private punchline. Sheriff Hayes tossed a file onto the observation desk, the contents spilling out. Arrest records, old mugshots, a faded adoption certificate for a K9 named Kaiser. Guy's got a record longer than Old Mill Road, Hayes grunted. Mostly B and E's, but this? He stabbed a thick finger at a decade-old police report. Unlawful confinement. Did 5 years upstate? Mia leaned closer, her eyes scanning the document. Says here his girlfriend at the time, Jenna Cole, reported him for assault. Case was dropped when she disappeared. She looked up sharply. Same year their dog went missing. Behind them, Shadow, Kaiser, paced the hallway, his nails clicking on the linoleum. The vet had cleaned and bandaged his injured paw, but he refused to rest, his attention fixed on the closed interrogation door. Every few minutes, a low growl rumbled in his chest. Daniel studied Victor through the glass. The man's nonchalance was too practiced, too polished. This wasn't his first time in an interrogation room. He kept trophies, Daniel said quietly. Those shoes weren't just discarded. He displayed them. Hayes nodded. We're tearing apart that shack. If there are more victims... The door creaked open, and Deputy Alvarez stepped in, holding an evidence bag. Inside was a child's pink hair ribbon, crusted with dirt. Found this buried near the shack's foundation. Forensics says it's at least 3 years old. Mia's grip on the file tightened. Inside the interrogation room, Victor finally broke his silence. You gonna stare at me all day? He called to the mirror. Or you gonna tell me why I'm here? His lips curled. Dog bite ain't a capital offense. Sheriff Hayes exhaled through his nose and reached for the door. Time to rattle his cage. The moment Hayes entered, Kaiser lunged forward, wedging himself in the doorway before Daniel could stop him. The dog didn't bark, didn't snarl, just stood there, his unblinking stare locked on Victor. Victor's smirk faltered. His fingers stilled mid-tap. You remember him, don't you? Daniel said, stepping into the room. Your dog, the one who, supposedly, ran away. Kaiser took a single step forward. Victor recoiled, his chair screeching against the floor. Hayes dropped the evidence bag on the table. The ribbon inside seemed to glow under the harsh fluorescence. We know about Jenna, Hayes said. We know about the others, and we will find them. Victor's mask cracked, just for a second, before he forced another smile. Good luck with that. But his eyes kept darting to Kaiser, to the dog who shouldn't be alive, to the witness who never forgot. Daniel crouched beside Kaiser, running a hand over the dog's scarred shoulders. Funny thing about K9s, he said, loud enough for Victor to hear. They're trained to track, to remember. He met Victor's gaze. And they never stop hunting. Victor's throat worked silently. Outside, the first drops of rain began to patter against the window. Somewhere in the dark woods, secrets waited to be uncovered, and Kaiser wasn't done digging. Rain drummed against the roof of the fire station, a relentless rhythm that had lasted for 2 days straight. Daniel stared at the evidence board they'd set up in the makeshift investigation room. Photos of Victor, the shack, Emma's rescue. but it was the center photo that held his attention. The blood-stained sneaker Kaiser had carried to their doorstep. Mia burst through the door, her rain jacket dripping, a thick case file clutched in her hands. "You need to see this." She slapped it onto the table, sending droplets flying. "Jenna Cole's sister just identified the shoe. It's hers." Daniel's stomach dropped. So Kaiser was bringing us to her? Not just her. Mia flipped open the file, revealing a map of the woods with red circles marking locations. Search teams found disturbed earth near the ravine. Cadaver dogs hit on something. Kaiser, lying on his bed in the corner, lifted his head. His ears pricked forward as if he understood every word. The excavation site was a nightmare of mud and flashing lights. Yellow police tape cordoned off an area where the earth dipped unnaturally, the rain having washed away the top layers to reveal what someone had tried to bury. Daniel's boots sank into the soggy ground as he approached. The forensic team worked in silence, their shovels scraping against something solid. Then, got something. A gloved hand brushed dirt from a skeletal wrist, the bones still draped with the remnants of a rotted sweater sleeve. Jenna's sister had described it. Navy blue with silver buttons. Kaiser strained against his leash, a whine building in his throat. Daniel unclipped him. The dog moved like a shadow through the rain, his nose skimming the ground until he reached the edge of the grave. There he sat, his body trembling. Not from cold, from grief. Mia crouched beside him, her voice barely audible over the rain. He knew she was here the whole time. A forensic tech lifted a small, mud-caked object from the grave. A dog collar, the leather brittle with age. The metal tag was corroded, but the name was still legible. Kaiser. Daniel's breath caught. Victor hadn't just killed Jenna. He'd tried to erase Kaiser, too. Back at the station, Kaiser lay with his chin on his paws, staring at the recovered collar on the table. Emma, wrapped in a blanket on the couch after another nightmare, watched him with wide eyes. "He's sad," she whispered. Daniel nodded, running a hand over Kaiser's back. The dog didn't lift his head, but his tail gave a single thump. Emma slid off the couch and patted over, her small hand resting on Kaiser's neck. "It's okay," she murmured. "You found her." Kaiser licked her fingers once. A quiet thank you. Outside, the rain finally eased. Somewhere in the newly washed woods, justice was taking root. And for the first time in 5 years, Kaiser could stop searching. The morning sun painted Pharaoh's town square in gold as the crowd gathered, their murmurs fading to silence when Mayor Wilkins stepped onto the makeshift podium. Kaiser sat at attention beside Daniel, his bandaged paw resting lightly on the wooden stage, his amber eyes scanning the faces before him. Children clutched their parents' hands, veterans stood straighter in their uniforms, reporters adjusted their cameras, lenses glinting in the light. "Today," the mayor began, his voice carrying across the square, "we honor not just a hero, but a promise kept." He lifted a small velvet box, opening it to reveal a gleaming medal suspended from a blue ribbon. The engraved words caught the sun, "For courage without command." Daniel knelt beside Kaiser, his fingers working gently to fasten the medal around the dog's collar. The weight of it settled against Kaiser's fur, and for a moment, the dog seemed to understand. He lifted his head higher, his gaze sweeping over the crowd before landing on Emma, who stood at the front row, her pink sneakers, new, unscarred, shuffling nervously. Emma broke from her mother's grip and darted forward, her small arms wrapping around Kaiser's neck. "You're the best dog in the whole world," she whispered, her voice muffled against his fur. Kaiser responded by pressing his muzzle into her shoulder, his tail thumping once against the stage. The crowd erupted into applause, but Mia, standing off to the side with the fire crew, noticed Kaiser's ears twitch toward the distant tree line. His gaze lingered there, as if listening to something, or someone, only he could hear. That afternoon, the fire station hosted a celebration. Balloons bobbed from the truck bay, and a table groaned under the weight of casseroles and cakes brought by grateful townspeople. Kaiser moved through the crowd like a quiet dignitary, accepting gentle pats and the occasional smuggled piece of roast beef with equal grace. Emma sat cross-legged on the floor, sketching Kaiser in her notebook, his metal gleaming, his ears perked. "I'm going to be a vet when I grow up," she announced to no one in particular, "for dogs like him." Daniel crouched beside her, studying the drawing. "You know, he'd like that." Kaiser ambled over, nudging Emma's elbow with his nose before settling beside her, his chin resting on her knee. The room seemed to soften around them, the laughter and chatter fading to a warm hum. As dusk painted the sky in shades of lavender, Kaiser led Daniel and Mia to the edge of the station's yard, where the first fireflies of the season flickered like tiny stars. He sat, his posture relaxed for the first time in weeks, and let out a long, contented sigh. Mia stroked his head. "You're home now, buddy." Kaiser leaned into her touch, his eyes half-lidded. The metal glinted in the fading light. Somewhere beyond the trees, a breeze stirred the leaves, carrying with it the faintest echo of a woman's laughter. Or maybe just the memory of it. Kaiser's ears twitched, but he didn't turn. He'd done what he came to do. Daniel ruffled the fur between Kaiser's ears. "Let's get inside, hero." Together, they walked back toward the warm glow of the station, the dog's tail wagging softly, his steps lighter than they'd been in years. The story wasn't over, not really. But this chapter? This one ended with peace.